Okay, we still have a couple of people coming in. Okay, welcome everybody. As usual, the first thing I'm going to do is ask you to put in your name and where you're from. And in case you don't know how to do that, I would think at this point most people do. What you're going to see on your screen are these icons. They look like cartoon bubble. You'll want to pick the one that's a cartoon bubble. You're going to get a box, and it looks like this. Type down here. Okay. Sounds good. All right, so let me start by asking a question. How many of you are you familiar with the term emotional intelligence? Have heard about it? Know what it is? Okay. Good. So I'm going to give you a little background on it, a little bit of the history of the concept, and really what it's about. Okay, and nothing terribly deep here. A lot of things in some ways you're familiar with already. I mean, the bottom line is Daniel Goleman wrote this book in 1995, but he really only codified what a lot of us already knew. I'm not sure I ever called it the same things he called it, but growing up we used to talk about somebody seeing red, and he now calls that emotional hijacking, but it still existed before. He didn't invent emotional intelligence, he kind of just defined it. So let's just talk a little bit about Goleman and his book, which I think really is a good book. It's a worthwhile read. And is definitely available in paperback and online at this point. But back in 1995, he wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence, and he, for the first time, began to talk about this difference, or this different view of intelligence than the traditional intelligence that we think about. And he hadn't been the first. Even Howard Gardner had talked about different types of intelligences and included some of these characteristics, but he really tried to drill down on what specifically is emotional intelligence. And he began by thinking about this idea, which again is not something unique, that in a sense we have two brains. We have the thinking brain, which is the brain that civilizes us, and we also have the brain that is the feeling brain. And sometimes it's also been called the reptilian brain or the early brain. It's the part of the brain that we share with the animals, because the nature, and the nature of how the brain was created, each individual species doesn't have a completely unique brain. We tend to share much in common with the brains of lower life forms, and then we kind of have more. We have a bigger brain or larger parts of the brain that do thinking, but a lot of the other parts that relate to regulating and protecting are really the same. Okay, and what he says is there are two minds. Now, in reality, that's more a construct. We really only have one mind. But there are kind of two functioning systems within the brain. There is the thinking brain and the feeling brain. How many of you would agree with that? And so what Goleman says is that there's also two ways of being smart. That you can be book smart, or what we think of as thinking smart, but you can also be feeling smart. And that some people are better than one than the other, and they're somewhat distinct, okay? And so, for example, the prevailing view on intelligence was always the IQ. And there's certainly been lots of controversy even about IQ, whether or not traditional IQ tests favor certain types of thinking over others, or certain kinds of intelligences over others. But what he really does is he almost says, I'm not talking about a different IQ. I'm talking about a different kind of intelligence altogether called EQ. So the thinking brain has the part of you has your IQ, and the emotional heart brain is EQ. Okay? And here's his definition. I actually apologize. I wrote it wrong in the descriptor. I had to clean it up a little. Okay? But, and I'm not even sure I love it even now. But what really is emotional intelligence, EQ? And don't read even what I said. I'll just give it to you, basically. I would say there are two characteristics to EQ. Okay? One is knowing yourself and being able to be in touch with how you feel at any given moment. What's going on in your head, okay, emotionally. And being able to make decisions, good decisions, based upon that. So, for example, if you know that you're about to wig out, and you might make the strategic decision to exit, that's an EQ intelligence. If you're not in touch with it, or you're in denial of it, then you might find yourself in a situation where, under normal circumstances, you'd handle it well, but because you're upset, you're not handling it well. So it's really about understanding yourself, and then being in touch with it. Think of it like taking your emotional temperature. You have this emotional thermometer, and you're able to measure it, and based on the readings, I don't know if I can mention temperature today, but based on the readings, you're making different decisions about the course of action you want to take at the current moment, how you want to react. So that's kind of one side of EQ. The other side of EQ, which is really intriguing, is your ability to detect that in others, to be able to sense people's emotions. And when I say sense it, it's not ESP. But, it's being able to read all the cues, a raised voice, body language, facial expressions, all the different things that may give you a read on where someone is at, and as a result, being able to make good decisions based on that. So, for example, if you're having a conversation with someone and you're getting the impression that instead of them listening, they're starting to look like, like a cartoon thing, with the steam coming out of the ears, even though you're not really seeing that, then maybe, again, you might make a decision. It's time to go into de-escalation mode rather than explanation mode, okay? Because at that point, the person's not capable of hearing it, Or, again, knowing that you can make a strategic exit. So how many of you can relate to both sides of this? Had a situation where you knew you were upset. Well, maybe you didn't handle it well, or you did. You knew you were upset, and you responded when you were upset, and in hindsight, you realized it would have been better if you would have taken a breath. You shouldn't have. By the way, I've often said, just kidding aside, it's not a kidding, it's actually true. Okay? There is a problem with the instantaneousness of our electronic communication today. Because think about it. In the old days, if you were upset and you wanted to, write it down, you wanted to compose an angry letter, okay? So you had to write it, okay? And I don't have to go back to the point we had to do it on a typewriter, but you had to type it, okay? And then you had to print it, okay? And then you had to put it in an envelope, and then you had to address the envelope, and then you had to mail it. That's a lot of time to realize this is really a bad idea. Okay? So today, you do the same thing. You hit an email, you hit send, and you go, and you're thinking 10 minutes later, maybe I shouldn't have been that harsh. So the first good bit of advice is when you're upset, don't ever send an email when you're upset. Always give it an hour or two, okay? But, it's just a proof of where you would be when you weren't emotionally upset might be different than you might have handled it another time. And then you can also think of times when maybe you made the strategic decision to exit or to avoid it, immediately because you knew you were upset. You waited. And that would be an example on both sides of this. And I think most human beings would say they've been on both ends of this, okay? One thing that Goleman says I think is really interesting. He says, the prevailing view on IQ is that you're kind of born with it. You're either smart or you're not smart. Now, smart and knowledgeable are not the same thing. A person might be inherently smart, but they don't have a lot of knowledge, and a person might not be naturally smart, but they make it up with hard work, and so they become more knowledgeable, even though it doesn't come easy to them. He has a different view of EQ. What he says about EQ is it can be developed. Now, he's the first one to admit, just like with every other talent, some people are just naturally more talented at this. It comes more natural to them. And for others, it doesn't come natural. But the fact that it doesn't come natural to you doesn't mean you couldn't get better at it over time. And I'll give you a perfect example of this that I think many of you can relate to if you've handled upset customers on the phone, okay? I ask you to think back to your first couple of days on the job. If you're in a kind of a job where, when you pick up the phone, people are going to be yelling at you. I think for most people, when that happens in the beginning, they're going to get pretty flustered, okay? And when I say flustered, it doesn't mean that you're going to go run off and cry, but it means that maybe you're not going to handle it in the most perfect way because you're going to be caught off guard and not prepared, and not quite used to it enough. Not leathered enough to the experience. And so you don't handle it so well. You do that for a year, where every day you're getting 25 calls. I will tell you, most people get more comfortable. You don't love it. You're never going to love it. But you're going to get more comfortable in the space and more able to think clearly in the situation. How many of you understand what I'm talking about? So that would be a perfect example of where you improved your emotional intelligence through experience. In this case, being leathered. Okay, and I give a parallel to this. I've mentioned to some of you I do martial arts. I don't spar a lot anymore. A little bit. I don't think there's too many people in my age group, so I don't have a lot of people to spar with. But and me sparring with a 16-year-old, that does not go well. But anyway, I kind of want to liken it to my experience in sparring. So when I first began to spar, I found the experience overwhelming. And it wasn't so much that I was afraid. I really wasn't afraid. I mean, I have a lot of trust in my fellow students, and we don't really, we don't hit to kill. It wasn't really like that. It's a sport. But I still found it overwhelming. The part of my brain that wanted to avoid getting hit and the part of my brain that wanted to think my way over what I needed to do, they were in conflict. And I found it really hard, and I didn't do really well because I wasn't able to think comfortably under the pressured situation. Because even though it's somewhat simulated, it's a classic fight and flight situation when someone's about to hit you, okay? And yet when I began to do it for longer and practice more, I got to the point where I could think on my feet. I didn't worry so much about, whether someone scored a point. I almost sometimes if they would get a good one, I go, that's a good one, But I wasn't so overwhelmed with that. And that's when I began to be able to think more strategically about, not just throwing everything in sight, but being more strategic about what technique I wanted to use and when. And while that is a physical example, I think it's a classic example of me developing EQ in that situation, okay, where the thinking brain was able to work better because the feeling brain wasn't overwhelmed. Does that make sense too? Okay. So I just want to talk about a basic idea, which is, many of us have been told not to trust our emotions and to almost think of them as a sign of weakness. And think about some of the terms they'll do. They'll say, oh, he's so emotional, she's so emotional. And I disagree with that. I fundamentally disagree with that. There's a reason why we have emotions. They serve a positive function in nature. They're self-protective. And so if you deny your emotions or act like they don't exist or feel bad because you have them, I don't think you learn to manage them well or understand them well. On the other hand, if you really understand them well and you see where they fit into the mix, you can learn to manage them strategically. But being in denial of them or feeling bad about them is a mistake, okay? By the way, I'm just going to ask you about a personal experience. And maybe I'm a little ahead of myself here on something I'm going to cover. But generally, when we're in a very stressful situation, a classic fight or flight, car accident, deer about to run into the road, some sort of a situation where a crisis, a colleague have an epileptic seizure, which happened to me recently in one of my districts. I was in there and somebody actually just had a seizure in the office, okay? And just kind of difficult situations. The emotional side tends to take over. And again, that may not necessarily be a bad case if you're facing an immediate car accident situation. What I often like to say is, if a deer, by the way, a little statistic. So I live in a place called Orange County, New York, okay? And we actually have the highest deer strike rate of any place in New York State. And it's interesting. There are more deer and I know we have some folks who are further up north in the Adirondacks. You have more deer up there, but you have fewer people. So we're the kind of and then down near the city there are fewer deer and a lot more people. So we're the kind of the confluence of the worst storm, So, yeah, exactly. So I actually had one on 84 on the interstate once, shortly after I moved to the area. But anyway, if a deer is about to jut out into your car, that's not a good time to think, I don't know, should I turn left or should I turn right? Splat. You have to be able to respond instinctually in those situations. Sometimes it goes well and sometimes it doesn't. The bottom line is that's not a time for deep thinking and pondering. It's a time for instinctive reactions. So they do serve a positive function, but they tend to cloud out everything else at the same time. That's kind of how they work, So I'm going to ask you about a more interpersonal example of that. So have you ever had a situation where you felt ambushed by a person? They attacked you verbally, hopefully not physically, but they attacked you verbally, and at that moment you just didn't think you responded as well as you would have liked to? Like maybe you froze up or you didn't say quite, let's put it this way, you weren't as eloquent as you could have been. And then all the way home, you're thinking about all the things you should have said but didn't say. Okay? All right. So the first thing I want to say is forgive yourself because you couldn't have. You see, when you were driving home, the emotional side of you wasn't operating. Okay? So at that point, you had all the time in the world to think of all these beautiful answers. But when you were caught off guard, you couldn't do it. And it's not any fault of yours. It's the way we're built. And that is why the ambusher has a natural home court advantage because they were prepared and you were not. Okay? So all I'm saying is if that happens, just instead of kicking yourself for why didn't I say that, understand you couldn't have. Now, admittedly, if it's something that happens every single day, like people are yelling at you about a particular thing, yeah, you will build the skills to build in automatic responses. But if you're caught off the blue, even if you're a great communicator, in most cases, you're not going to say it best, okay? You see what I mean? Okay. So it's interesting. And I could actually almost back to this other slide again. There are really some interesting questions about which skill, and I don't think you have to make a decision about, this isn't a mutually exclusive situation. We have to say, well, one is important and the other is not. But maybe we, in some cases, overemphasize the importance of IQ and underemphasize the importance of EQ as an essential life and career skill. And that was the argument that Goleman made. When you really look at what it takes to survive and navigate in the world, it may be that you would be equally served, and maybe even better served, if you had a stronger EQ than necessarily just having a high IQ. Okay? And let's just take a look at this list. Okay, so these are common characteristics for leadership. Okay, and think about how many of them require some degree of emotional intelligence. Certainly communication, interpersonal skills, listening, adaptability, personal management, some of them are not, obviously reading, writing, math skills, and, but so many of the things on this list require some element of EQ for success. How many of you would agree with that? So I love this picture only because it's cute, okay? But, I have met some people who are intelligent, but socially inadept, okay? Inept. They are like clueless. And in fact, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'll talk about my, when I was I think I was still in high school or college. So I met a young woman, a girl. I was only 17 myself. And she was a brilliant, top of her class, highest SAT scores, okay? An amazingly bright person. Probably got a scholarship to Harvard, okay? Really that kind of a person. When it came to social things, really, really a little on the off side, a little clueless. Now, she was very sweet. She was a really kind and nice person. She wasn't clueless and in kind of negative ways. There are people that are clueless in negative ways. They don't pick up cues. But she was actually clueless in nice ways. But everybody would almost laugh at her because here was this person who was so brilliant, and she seemed to have like zero street smarts or everyday smarts. Okay, so I'm just suggesting that those things they're two different things, And I'm not trying to downplay what she did. I'm sure she went on to great success, but I would bet she's always been a little quirky. She may even have ironically been a brilliant and also a tad bit autistic. But in those days, nobody talked about that. You know what I mean? So she was just brilliant and kind of, clueless. By the way, anybody know anybody like this? Like, just really, really super bright, but kind of, I've met a few university professors like this, But, and again, I'm not trying to knock anybody. I just want to point out that, they're almost like two different things, okay? And the good thing about EQ is it is developable, okay? So again, just look at some of these things that we think of as important success indicators for our ability to get things done on the job. The ability to manage yourself, working with members of your team, interacting effectively with a boss who may have a different personality or approach than you have, and then being able to interact with customers who have different personalities and different approaches. So almost all of that is the examples of emotional intelligence at work, where you really need those skills. And again, I probably overdid this, but these are just more examples. Okay. So I pose it in terms of an interesting idea, particularly for a leader. Okay, so suppose I have a really brilliant idea about how to do things better, but I lack the emotional intelligence to get others to embrace it. Because even though it may be a brilliant idea, if I don't understand other people enough, I don't know how to structure the appeal to get them on my side. I've had a number of superintendents do workshops on leadership, and as I think back about it now, I think there's always been like an overriding theme in those. And it's a couple. For the most part, it's not about deep understanding of processes. It's more about establishing critical relationships, understanding what's doable and not doable, figuring out how to get people on board, because ultimately leadership is about getting things done through other people. And so if you don't have, a strong emotional intelligence, you may have the most brilliant ideas, but they sit on the shelf because you can't get other people to support them. How many of you would agree with that? So here's another one, and this, by the way, this dovetails to our conversation about that I did in the customer service for those who are repeat customers here. I talked about the person who does an objective good job, but eats people's heart out. They just can't do the job and do it. They have to let you know how much it, how much it's an inconvenience to them. By the way, how many of you know somebody like that? Like, they'll do things for you, but they gotta let you know how much it's annoying to them. Okay? All right. So, I've done some training for folks, and I always believe in the potential for improvement in folks, but I really do think that people like this, they shoot themselves in the foot, because to really get credit for things you do, you obviously have to deliver. You have to do them. But if you don't deliver them cheerfully, instead of people remembering what you did for them, they remember how they were made to feel. Okay? So I just bring that up because I think it's just important to kind of look at that element of this. Does that make sense? Okay. So, by the way, I can talk about this in my personal life. I'm not so sure that I was so good at this when I was younger. I had a dad who was like this. He just loved to eat my mom's heart out. He could never do anything for you without letting you know how much he really didn't like it or how much he was put upon it. And I think I carried some of that into my early relationships, where my wife at the time, of course I'm not married anymore, but that's not the reason. But anyway, would ask me to do things, and instead of just doing them, I would just I'd gripe about them, and then I would eventually have to do them anyway. And then instead of her being happy about me doing them, she'd be annoyed because I, broke her chops. Okay, and again, I'll ask how many of you know anybody like that. Okay, all right. So at some point I made a decision in my life, a personal decision. First of all, I realized at some point rationally that that's just not working. Okay, so I made a decision, and I really have stuck to it throughout these years. I've decided if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. I mean, and if I'm not going to do it, I'm not going to do it. I'm the first one to admit, if I feel like I'm being taken advantage of, or I really don't want to do something, I won't do it. Okay, but along the lines, I've also said, if I'm going to do it, I'm not going to break anybody's chops about it. That's just not how it works. Do it or don't do it, but if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it cheerfully. Okay? So I can only tell you, and really, I didn't really mind doing this. Well, nobody would love this, but, I'll tell you my personal story, okay? So my girlfriend has, and she's wonderful. She's an awesome grandmother. She has children in Maryland, in the Baltimore, and she has 2 grandchildren in Baton Rouge. And as much as possible, she never misses a birthday. I mean, maybe she can't always make it on the day, but if one of her grandchildren has a birthday, she manages to get to them, within a couple of days and celebrate. And she just feels committed to this. She has the resources to do it, and she wants to do it, and I commend her for it, because it's hard, but she does. And so one time she was in Baton Rouge, and she had a connecting flight to Atlanta. And when she arrived at Atlanta, they told her her next flight had been canceled, which was to one of our local airports. So they gave her, and if any of you traveled, you get these kinds of decisions. They gave her a 10-minute, make a decision now. They told her, okay, we can't get you to the airport you want to go to, but I can get you to another New York area airport. I can get you to Newark, okay? And she had like a couple of minutes to decide. So she said, so she wanted to do it. So she called me on the phone, and she said, look, I really have a big favor. I need you to pick me up at about 10:30 at night in Newark and drive me, so I can get my car, because I have to go to work the next day, okay? So I said, and I was tired, but it wasn't the end of the world. I wouldn't die. So I said, no problem. What's the flight number? I'll meet you in Newark. I'll pick you up. Okay, don't worry about it. Okay? So I picked her up, and when we're in the car, the first thing she says is, I feel so bad about this. I know it's late. And I said, no problem. Don't worry about it. And then as we're driving, it's about an hour plus drive, to get her car. She must have a couple of more times said, yeah, I know this is really an inconvenience. It's so late. And I go, no problem. Don't worry about it. It's fine. Okay? And then we finally got her car. When I dropped her off at the airport to get her car, she says, I really do appreciate this. And I says, no problem. You would do it for me. And she would. Okay? She would do it for me. Okay? So the point is, that's the way to go. Because had I said, oh my God, I'm so tired, if she had said, how are you? And I said, I'm exhausted, even if I didn't actually berate her, I just made her bad for a situation that she really had no control over. Instead of appreciating what I did, she would not appreciate it. Okay? So if you come away from this session with nothing else than that, okay, I think that's an important takeaway. How many of you would at least agree that's an important life skill? Okay? That I should have learned earlier, but I guess, Okay. So if you have a good emotional intelligence, that builds strong relationships. Because there really are few jobs where you can really work on a desert island. And it doesn't make for a very good personal life either. I mean, there are a few jobs where you don't have to interact with people a lot, but most jobs you do. And certainly in the public sector, it's a rarity to find too many jobs. We're in a people business. By the way, an interesting story about that. And I don't think that my stories are digressions. They're really useful. So I think, you may think they're ridiculous, but all right, I guess you wouldn't hang out here if you did. Okay, so I have another just quick story to tell you. So I did exactly, okay? But, we're finding a way to connect. That's the point, okay? So I'm just going to tell you a little bit of another little bit of a story. So I was doing and we may actually, I don't know who, I didn't ask what your job titles were, but I'll share what this is. So I have been doing some online training for our state association of transportation supervisors. These are people that run the school bus departments, okay? And we have most states have associations, and ours has one. And what I had done is I was doing an online panel. And the panel, actually, the topic of the panel was moving up to director. So we had a couple of people who were currently directors. We had one who was very experienced, had a lot of years. We had somebody who is fairly new on the job, and we had somebody who was, I'll say, an heir apparent, being groomed for the position. She was now a dispatcher, and her boss had pretty much said, I'm going to go in about a year. And while there's no guarantee she would get the job, they were kind of grooming her, teaching her all the skills, And one or two of the folks said, I always felt a little bit behind the eight ball because I really don't have a college degree, And this is somebody who is extremely well respected in the field, but just never went to college, okay? And she says, especially being in schools where everybody's got a master's degree, I always felt a little bit, behind the eight ball, with everybody else. But then she began to talk about her life experiences and how they had, prepared her. And she said, it's interesting. When I first took this position, I figured it was really about, moving around all these little yellow things with kids in them. And then I really realized it's really a people business. I mean, I have to deal with the drivers, I have to deal with the parents, I have to deal with my colleagues. It's more about the people than about the machines. Not that I don't need to have technical knowledge and all the rules. There's tons of rules in transportation, more than almost any other area of education, actually. Okay, for good reason. It's a safety issue. But, she said that. And then what she said, which is really interesting, she says, of all the things that I had done previously that helped me prepare to be successful, the thing that I think helped me best was being a waitress. She says, before I became even a bus driver, I had been a waitress for a number of years. And she said, I learned a lot of skills as a waitress that really helped me to be successful as a transportation director. And you can bet the skills she learned were emotional intelligence skills and dealing with upset people and, and managing things. So, and then one of the other people in the panel said, absolutely, I also did that early in my life, and that was a big help to me too. So I'm just bringing this up because it's amazing what kinds of life skills you can have before that can help you prepare that you might not think of as the ones that would be most central to success. So again, Goleman, gets to this question of whether this comes from whether you're born with it or whether you learn. And he again says he acknowledges that some people are just naturally better at this. But he really tends to think more of it can be enhanced than is traditionally thought of with IQ. And I already said this before, so I'm going to repeat it again. Emotions are not a bad thing. Right? Right, exactly. So there were even when I think back at some of the early jobs I did, even like in college, they really helped me as well. So it's easy to confuse being a good person with having a high EQ. Because if we generally have somebody who's an unpleasant person and difficult to work with, we assume they're lacking in EQ. Okay, but maybe they actually have a high EQ and they have figured out that being difficult means they have to do less. Okay, so I'm not suggesting it's good to be a difficult person, but it's possible to be an extremely nice person and not have a good EQ because you let people walk all over you. Okay, or they abuse you, or you try to over please, and therefore you can't, you're not reliable on commitments because you're overwhelmed, or you capitulate on issues you shouldn't capitulate on. So, we shouldn't confuse being nice and being pleasant with having a high EQ. Not that it isn't good to be a nice or pleasant person, but that's not the same skill. Okay? So again, I'm somewhat repeating, but it's worthwhile saying. So emotions cloud rational thinking temporarily. And part of this makes total logical sense. It's fight or flight, okay? The body has to focus on its resources. So at the moment that you're faced in a dangerous situation, it's best that the parts of your brain that are going to protect you take over, okay? And so some of the higher order thinking kind of disappears for a while. Now again, the more you can, like my sparring example, I had the fog in the beginning. And then eventually, through practice, I was able to reduce the fog, okay? But initially, that's a normal reaction for anyone, is to have the fog, okay? And so just being aware that you're in the fog can itself be helpful in terms of how you make some decisions at the moment. By the way, I give a hypothetical for this, and it's only a hypothetical but I'm sure all of you can relate to it. How many of you have had like almost a near miss with a deer or a car accident or something like that? And so you're a bit shaken up. If someone tapped you on the shoulder right after that and said, by the way, what is 16 times 3? How many of you think you'd have a hard time calculating that at that moment? I believe that most people would. Even me, who's good at math, would have a hard time. And there's a reason, because the parts of the brain that are involved in doing that are kind of put on hold a bit, okay? And then eventually the fog clears. And in fact, I've had it described, this way. So one of the things that Goleman talks about is emotional hijacking, which again, as I mentioned, before I'd heard the term, I was familiar with what it was, okay? But he put a name to it. And so what emotional hijacking is, it's where the emotional part of your brain actually hijacks your thinking brain. And that's when you say things you wished you hadn't. How many of you have said things you wish you hadn't? Me too, okay? And the reason for that is, at that moment, your emotions took over. Now, what I always say is, by the way, what people say when they're really upset is probably what they feel. But, I'm willing to, I really don't need to know what's in everybody's brain. I'm willing to accept that if they rationally make the decision not to be nasty to me or, vent at me, that it's okay. That I know that they really don't want to do it. But probably, when they're upset, if they're telling me something, it probably is how they're feeling at some level. So there's some truth in it, but it's without a filter. And we really would not want to live in a world where people had no filters all the time. But, right. But I think part of where I'm at with this is this really helps me to forgive more. So I have had situations, both in training and in interpersonal things with employees when I was a supervisor, where people would have a meltdown from time to time. They'd get really upset, and they would say things to me or to others that I know in calmer moments they wouldn't say. And because I really understand this, I'm more able to be forgiving of it. I understand that it's probably deep what's in their heart, but I also know they wouldn't say it if they weren't upset. So I can forgive them a little bit. And in some cases, I can even protect them a little bit by causing a pause. So if I'm running a meeting and I see that someone's emotionally hijacked, maybe I'll find a way to get them out of the meeting or end the meeting before things get rawer than they need to, because it operates for both individuals. So understanding emotional hijacking, understanding how it works, it allows you to have more empathy. It allows you to understand yourself, but it also allows you to make some good strategic decisions where maybe it's time to end something right now just because nobody's thinking well. And how many of you have sometimes found yourself in a situation like that? Gee, I just wish somebody would have, hit the timeout bell. Now, I do ask people to learn to build a little self-control. I don't want you to come away from this thinking that we have no responsibility because we are emotionally hijacked. We have no responsibility to try to exercise some self-control. I understand if you push anybody far enough and they're upset enough, they're going to flip out, and that's just normal, okay? But if you're going to flip out over everything, then that's problematic as well, okay? And so even though I want people to forgive themselves, I also want to raise self-awareness. So one of the ways that you can raise self-awareness is to look at these two, what I have in front of you. I'll ask someone, are you a thermostat? Were you? Because normally we're reflecting later. There's no point in reflecting when you're upset, but if you're going to do like an after action on what happened, I will ask people this question. Do you think that in the situation you were a thermostat or a thermometer? So first I'll ask the question, what's the difference between right, exactly, don't poke the bear, exactly. Okay, so in this particular situation, well, first of all, what's the difference between a thermostat and a thermometer? I'll throw that out to you as a group. Anybody want to tell me? And if I don't hear from anybody in a minute, I'll answer. Correct. So a thermometer reacts to the temperature. If it's hot, it gets hot. So when people say, oh, he started or he pushed me and then I pushed back, that's a thermometer type reaction, okay? It's completely reactive. A thermostat moderates the temperature, right? So if it's too hot, it tries to make it cooler. If it's too cool, it warms it up. So the question was, what were you in the circumstance? Were you simply reacting to the other person, or were you, even if you didn't completely succeed, were you trying to be a moderator, a de-escalator of the situation? And that's a good learning experience for us. You have to do it with some level of it. There's a practice skill. You're not going to get it right away. But I think when I've had people, even by the way, I've done this with children, and I have some classroom teachers who just tell me how you handled it. No blame. And when the kid points to the thermometer, then they say, okay, what would have helped you be more effective as a thermostat? Counting to 10, visualizing, walking away, what would have possibly worked? And so you can put those tools in your toolbox. And by the way, I really am a believer that we should be teaching children about emotional intelligence and enhancing their EQ in early life, because it's something that can be learned early. I don't expect young children to have adult reactions, but I think this is a skill that can be developed early. Okay, and we do try. Schools do. Okay? I mean, they teach kids how to take turns and how to share and do all those things, But, so then the next step I would say, Deborah, is then when if the child doesn't do that, ask them what they were. Once you teach them the difference between a thermostat and a thermometer, what they were, and then ask how they could have been better at that. What words could have they used? Does that make sense? So here's another element. I know we don't have a lot of time left, and this is another one of those topics we could go on, certainly for another hour at least. But, part of there's this notion of emotional empathy, okay? And I gave an example of emotional empathy already. This notion that if someone is seeing, is emotionally hijacked, we can then provide some forgiveness because we understand that deep in their heart they didn't really want to do this. Okay? But they were just upset at the time. But there's another element of this, and that is the ability to assess people's emotions and moods when they run contrary to what they're saying. And that is often the case. So, for example, if you turn around to people and you ask, well, how are we all getting along? And everybody goes, fine, and they all have their arms folded, and they're looking at each other like growling dogs. Emotional empathy is the ability to be able to sense that what a person is saying isn't really aligned to what they're thinking or feeling. And I've often said, I don't think people lie as well with their bodies than with their words. So if the words, unless they're an actor, which is the career where you're taught to lie with your body, okay? But, most people are not that good at it. So if people are in a meeting and I'm proposing a new idea and everybody is saying fine, but they all look in their faces like they're nauseous, it's good emotional empathy to be able to say, I get the sense you really don't like that idea. So to dig a little deeper. So how many of you would say there have been situations where what a person was saying and what they were feeling, you got the sense they were different, okay? And the ability to read it and understand it. And again, if I had more time, I'd give you some more examples of this. By the way, I have discovered that the smarter people are, the more they learn to coat what they're really feeling with all this intellectualism. I don't philosophically agree. I even had this with parents, We had a parent that came in and they would say, as a clinical psychologist with a you can tell what area of the country I came from, with a specialty in, in pediatric childhood development, I don't philosophically agree with the approach you're using in the classroom. Okay? So that's what they're saying. What are they feeling? I'm worried about how my kid's doing. Okay? Okay. So, so the ability to almost get under, by the way, it's a recommendation I give to leaders. If you get somebody that comes in and they want to discuss philosophy, most parents that meet with a principal don't really care about philosophy. They're worried about their kid, and so if you can say, let's cut to the chase, what's your concern with your child? And then they're willing to open up, that's when you can start to manage it. Because we usually don't win a philosophical debate anyway, and it really isn't at the heart of the issue, even though they may code it in that, So you can kind of, just this ability to understand this. Like I said, I could do an hour on emotional empathy, but I want you to just think about how important a skill that is. One thing about emotions, they live in the present. In fact, we may not even remember how we felt a week ago about something. They're very, very much, locked in time. Whereas the thinking brain, it has more memory. We don't have as much emotional memory. So I think we're going to wrap up here. I'm just going to share this with you. It's kind of cute, okay? And I unfortunately can't show you a video here, but It's called the marshmallow experiment. Has anybody ever heard of it? But by the way, there's some wonderful videos. They are the cutest videos you can ever see on YouTube of the marshmallow experiment. Okay, so what they do is they put two kids. Usually they put two kids in the room, right? And they put a marshmallow in front of them, and they tell them that if they don't eat the marshmallow for 15 minutes, they're going to get 3 marshmallows. Okay. If they eat the marshmallow, this is all they're getting. But if they wait, they're going to get 3 marshmallows. And it's fascinating to watch how the kids react to that, okay? Because some of them just gobble up the marshmallow. Some of them stare at it, eventually eat the marshmallow. Some are actually have enough emotional intelligence to be able to wait because they want the 3. And there is some evidence that kids who took them, because they've been doing the marshmallow test for like 30 years, that kids who have this delayed gratification do better in college, okay? That actually translates up. Now, whether it's because they're innately better or it's a built skill, nobody completely understands. But understand part of not responding in the moment and being able to think ahead is also a part of emotional intelligence. Okay, so we've got to end. Thank you for participating this week in all these sessions. As I mentioned, I'm going to probably be pushing out, so I will be pushing out some info on Excel. And I may or may not do some additional soft skills stuff. Certainly if, as you can imagine, it's a struggle these days. A lot of the work I do is in district. So, let me know if your districts have any interest in training, and then we'll go from there. Okay? Thank you. And yes, I'll send you more info on the Excel. Okay? So have a great day. Thanks. Bye.